Thank you for watching. We have a cast of thousands that are around the country. With us in Melbourne, none other than the great Darren Hinch. The beard coming back well. How long do you think it will take before the luscious locks return to the chin?
Couple more weeks.
Okay, keep it going. The delightful Fiona Scott, who has no plans of growing a beard anytime soon, Liberal MP in Western Sydney, and Janet Albrechtson, and the beautifully bearded Peter Berner. Guys, let's jump into a couple of other quick things that are around the country today. Repeal Day, where, you know, there was apparently an awful lot of regulations that are being booted. I don't know how obscure they are, and I don't know ultimately how it ends up helping our lives. Fiona will tell us why the government thinks it's all right in a second, but here's the PM saying Repeal Day is awesome.
It's government's job to serve the people, not people's job to serve the government. In simple terms, we work for you. And we're working for you today by creating the biggest bonfire of regulations in our country's history.
All right, so you're doing the dance around the bonfire a bit earlier. Now that explains what it was. Is this getting rid of things that actually affect people, or have you just been able to shake all of the bits of legislation and the bits that say, you know, you have the right to tie your horse up next to every light pole? I mean, what real stuff changes?
Well, I guess the first piece is that the previous government did introduce 21,000 new regulations, and for small business that's quite a impost. Each minister, and one by one, has been putting out their package as to what it's going to mean in every single portfolio. For me, locally, childcare, for instance, there is a huge amount of red tape with regard to some of the reporting that is required, which is taking childcare providers or staff off the floor because they're busy filling out other bits of paperwork. There's things like that which will actually mean that it'll put childcare workers back out on the floor again. Another one today, I was hearing about a DVD video, and each time it is presented in another format, so whether it's 2D, 3D, DVD, it has to go through another degree of actually being, what's the word, rated.
Yeah, okay, right.
So rather than having...
so it goes back through classification.
It gets
so a movie that came out in a cinema gets reclassified to come out on VHS, gets reclassified to come out on DVD.
So yeah, it got reclassified to come out as a 2D, reclassified to be 3D, reclassified to be Blu-ray, reclassified to be DVD. So you're talking about being classified 4 times when you can actually just do it once. So I'm going to give a bit of a plug. So we've got cuttingredtape.gov.au, which means that people and organisations can jump online and say, okay, this is regulation that's not working for us, or can you look into it? So we're actually looking for submissions from people to come back to.
Darren, on the Ages website in Melbourne, the question was, is the cutting red tape a priority for the government? Yes, only 30% of people said it was good because it gets rid of unnecessary costs. 69% say that the repeal day is a stunt. When you hear about examples like the constant regulation around rating a movie, it makes sense, but are there 1,600 problems we had to get rid of?
I think they're on the right track, and I'm sure there are heaps of things that should be removed. I have one question, though, just watching the Prime Minister again in Parliament. Does Tony Abbott always now have to speak to us as if we are uncomprehending 10-year-olds, because he always repeats himself,
That's not a bad one. Janet, how do you feel about the Prime Minister's presentation of it? Is Darren on to something?
Well, yeah, he seems to have the Julia Gillard disease sometimes. I wonder what happens when you actually become Prime Minister, that you start to talk very slowly. So hopefully he'll lift it up a bit, because we're actually quite smart. And, you know, on the smart front, I think there's been a big change in terms of what we expect governments to do. There was always this sense that governments needed to do something, and therefore you had the Gillard and Rudd governments bragging about passing all these laws. And as Malcolm Turnbull said during question time today, the Abbott government is changing that paradigm completely, turning it on its head. The imperative is not to do something. The imperative is not to boast about how many laws you've passed. The imperative is now to get rid of laws. And let's face it, if you want small businesses to grow bigger in this country, you need big government to grow smaller. And that means getting government out of our lives, less intrusion, less duplication, and getting rid of laws that really have no great benefit.
Now, Peter, a couple of other... Sorry, Darren, I think I heard your voice there. Go.
I'd say, yeah, good point, Janet. I agree with you.
All right, now, Peter, I want to turn your attention here to the great global issue that is Crimea. Firstly, I'll show you the Foreign Minister. Now, she is backing in the idea of sanctions as a way of telling Putin he can't just have whatever bit of the globe he wants. Let's have a look at what the Foreign Minister had to say just a little earlier today.
Today, I announce the Australian Government will impose targeted financial sanctions and travel bans against those who have been instrumental in the Russian threat to Ukraine's sovereignty. The actions taken by Russia are a clear violation of international rules prohibiting the use of force.
Now, I have no doubt that there's a need to send Russia a message, but let's be very honest here, Peter. You know, Vladimir Putin was able to roll in and steal a part of somebody else's country without firing a bullet. Do you think he could give a tuppence, to use the old language, about what the Western world wants to do with individuals? There is no way we can send a message to a bloke who is willing to steal other parts of the world.
Well, that's very true. I'd like to think that at least we're all standing sort of shoulder to shoulder and sending him the same message. Whether he chooses to heed any warnings from the West as to curbing his behaviour or not, I get the impression from Vladimir Putin that you're right. He's not particularly interested in what anyone has to say if it contradicts something he's thought already.
Well, but also, now, Janet, aren't we in a system...
Paul, this may sound like... look, I listen to Julie Bishop, I've listened to even President Obama. This has got a touch of the, we warn you, Mr Khrushchev. Putin will do what he wants to do. I mean, this is... Well, nothing we do is going to stop this. And Crimea will end up back with Russia. And he's not going to give up the fleet in the Black Sea. I mean, Ukraine was cobbled together anyway. The West will huff and puff, and it won't... whether he's right or wrong, it's not quite Hitler invading Czechoslovakia or whatever. This is something that will happen, and we can talk all we want. It's not going to change things. Putin knows exactly what he's doing, where he's going, and it will happen.
Well, Janet, that's the whole problem, isn't it? Is that you've got a bloke who's well, basically already given the middle finger to the world. You know, one month he's got the Olympics with the world coming over for a party. The next he's carving up bits of the map for himself. I mean, what response can a country like Australia have, let alone America or anyone else?
Yeah, it's hard to know, you know, where this is going. But don't forget that a democratically elected pro-Russian government in the Ukraine was overthrown. Putin's a Cold War warrior. He looks at the Ukraine and Crimea as critical parts of, you know, the geopolitical sphere of Russian influence. Of course, he's going to be doing what he's doing. I'm not surprised that he's doing what he's doing, and that he's completely ignoring what the US, what Britain, and no matter how strong the words of Julie Bishop today, echoing William Hague last night, no matter how strong those sanctions are and other export bans introduced by Britain, it's hard to see that Putin's going to take any notice of that.
All right. Now, Darren, once again, I wanted to touch back in on where we were at the start of the show, and I hope by the time you come off the air at humanheadline.com.au, it has sailed through the air. You've got a federal MP here. You've got a person who's got the ear of the Prime Minister. Why do we need the National Register of Sex Offenders? How does it work? And how do we avoid that information being used by the vigilantes?
Well, the vigilante issue is the one which comes up all the time. Now, I went to the United States last year, did a lot of work on this for Sunday Night, the program. And President Clinton brought this law in 20 years ago, 1996. He brought it in the States after a young girl called Megan was murdered, a 7-year-old. And you haven't had the vigilantism that people are talking about. I mean, I can go on an app on my phone in any state. I did it in Times Square, I did it in Texas, where you hit the app and up comes like a motel. Like you type in the word motel, up would come where all the little motels were dotted over your phone. I'd type in sex offenders and it comes up and shows you where all they are living, their names, their photographs, what they've done, what their crimes were. In Texas, I drove around, was pointed out to me, there's where a sex offender lives. He lived in a normal sort of house. He had a flag on his front lawn and nobody's running around with Molotov cocktails to try and burn his house down. In Texas, they have laws that say that if you attacked a sex offender, you would be charged with and could be jailed for up to 10 years. So those sort of restrictions and those sort of safeguards are there. The thing I want, that you have to have state laws, obviously, for the delight to have a uniform law, and I hope that that Brandis can pull, the Attorney General federally can get at COAG, can get the state attorneys general to come up with a national uniform register, and it would have to be run by the federal government, and it would be of all convicted sex offenders, and that would be, you wouldn't be able to change your name the way that Cowan, the killer of Daniel Morecambe, changed his name, and you would be on that register. And the state of Texas, state of California, you go to their state government websites and there they all are. They're listed there as plain as day. And I cannot see why you in the public should not know. And I'll give you a quick example here. I go to court today, because courts must be open. I sit there and watch a case of a sex offender. He's convicted by a magistrate or a judge. And he said, I'm now putting you on the sex offenders register. If I walk out of that courtroom, something mysterious happens. I can see him, I know his name in court. The minute I walk out, if I publish his name or show his photograph, I'm suddenly in breach and could go to jail. Why are they protected? Murderers aren't protected when they've done their time. Tax avoiders aren't protected. Why are sex offenders? Because they say, oh, it's for their rehabilitation. I've yet to see a sex offender who is rehabilitated. And by being anonymous, they have even more chance to reoffend.
Well, I agree, and there's increasing evidence about what happens here, exactly what happened in the Morecambe case. I also think it's important to note, and I want to burst the bubble about people who always talk about the vigilante thing. There are laws against such things. You can't go and set fire to somebody's house. That in and of itself is illegal. If you harass somebody, that's illegal. You punch them in the face, that's illegal. Fiona, how do you feel about it? You represent an area full of families, full of people who traditionally would agree with what Darren is saying. How do you feel about knowing where a sex offender is in your area?
I think it's a big area of concern. I have, in fact, the 4th youngest electorate in the country because my electorate is, as you said, full of families. I think I agree with Darren. It's a COAG challenge between the Attorney Generals, both state and federal, to come up with an appropriate solution. But I definitely don't think we can continue the way we are at the moment. To see some of the stories that are out and about, and there's several of them that I just think are very concerning.
Are these stories starting to register? I mean, in the corridors, no doubt last week when Daniel Morecambe and the details of the man who killed him, his past, surely that registered in the corridors of power here saying, geez, we're going to work out what to do here. If the responsibility is, Brandis and the AGs work it out, but it would have registered here, didn't it?
Well, look, I haven't had a conversation directly with the Attorney General to say where he's at or what he's doing in that space. But I will definitely have a conversation with him, and it is something that I have heard through my electorate office, through people in my community that do have very strong feelings about this.
All right. Well, Janet, how do you feel about it? Is it something that should be put in place? I mean, as I said, I just believe the vigilante thing, as Darren says, is always popped up by people who want to go too hard basket on it here. What do you think?
Look, I think the concern should always weigh in terms of protecting the community, and I think often we see courts and we see parole boards not protecting the community sufficiently. And I know on this matter, I would see this as a measure for protecting the community, and therefore it makes sense. And as you say, there are laws against vigilantes. We ought to be entitled to this information. I don't want to be, living with young children next to someone who is a convicted sex offender. But it's a broader issue than just that. I think it's about our courts and our parole boards taking the community interest and safety into account. The balancing act, I don't think they've gotten right.
Well, to me also, I think that in the same way that we're having conversations about mandatory sentencing for drunk people who punch people with one punch in the streets, could we start having chats about mandatory minimums when you effectively ruin somebody's life forever, as close to sort of a psychological version of murder? How do you feel about it, Peter? I mean, over years I've had an evolution on this where what I was cautious at start, but once you start reading and more cases and you talk to victims and talk to their families, I'm all in. What do you think?
Well, I'm not about making convicted sex offenders' life any easier. The law against vigilantism, there's law against people robbing banks, but they still do it. I remember when Dennis Ferguson was released, the people in the neighbourhood a number of times rejected and were outraged by the fact that he'd been housed in their neighbourhood, and there were hoses pushed through his front door and he was hounded from one piece of accommodation to the next. Now, I'm not out to make Dennis Ferguson's life any easier. He did some pretty horrible things and therefore should pay the price. The concern is that the members of the community that get fired up then do something irrational or hot-tempered themselves and find themselves then on where their life was all wonderful, now find themselves in a court of law doing 10 years. That concerns me. So the notion of...
Peter, on this issue, Peter, I've been getting emails lately, of course, because of the the number of people signing and the discussion going on, and I welcome it. And people say, oh, but in Australia we are passionate, we are hot-blooded people. You wouldn't find more hot-blooded, passionate people, and they've got guns, than Americans, than rednecks in America. And so I specifically looked at this, and I know that Bravehearts, surprisingly, is not in favour of a national register, and yet the policemen I talk to in the United States, in Florida and New Jersey, they think it's a great idea. Now, in some states in America have gone even further. I'll give you an example. In some states, I think it's in Florida, where if I'm a real estate agent and I try to sell you a house, and I know that the neighbour is a registered sex offender, I must tell you, before I sell you that house, that this house is next to a sex offender. Now, that's going to an extreme area, but that hasn't resulted in people burning houses down or pulling out guns and shooting people. I cannot say that I guarantee two things. One, you can't guarantee that more Daniel Morecambe cases won't happen. They will. And I can't guarantee there'll never be a vigilante. But in cases like Ferguson, the people who were smashing his windows or kicking his door in, they should have been charged. The same way that I don't believe that when you put in jail, I cop this all the time, I was in here, people saying, oh, let them out in mainstream, let the other prisoners deal with them. If you in a mainstream prison and you assault a pedophile, you should be charged with assault. The penalty is to be locked up, and I hope locked up for a long, long time. But you don't take the law into your own hands inside prison or outside prison. You don't castrate prisoners, you don't do all those sorts of things, but it boils down to one thing. The community's safety is paramount. The safety of children is paramount. Those pedophiles and those rapists have forfeited some of their rights, as they should. Yep. And the parents of kids are the ones who should have the rights, and they must be protected. And that's why I'll go to my grave fighting for this, and we will win.
And that's why we love you. All right, humanheadline.com.au, humanheadline.com.au. If you believe it, if you agree with it, sign it, and let's make sure that Fiona gets the strongest hand possible to at least have the conversation with the Attorney General. Quick break, back with more.